Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Thank you for downloading another episode from the Unconventional Soldier podcast, which aims to record the history of the British Army STA Patrols Unit through the voices of veterans who serve in its ranks. Today we're talking to Lee Chapman, and what we'll be talking about on this one is the Balkan tours, both Bosnia and Kosovo. In this episode, we'll cover the battery's involvement in both of these operations in which we deployed, either as individual patrols, troop-size operations, or as a battery. These continuous deployments into the Balkans span from 1995 to 2000. Finally, we'll finish off with Desert Island Dits, Lee's choice of book, film and luxury item. So Lee, over to you. When did you join the battery and what drew you to it?
So I joined the battery in the early 90s. I think my first, the patrol course or selection as it was back then that I did was literally the first one after the battery had come back from the Gulf. So the first Gulf, so crikey, 30 odd years ago. But prior to that, I joined the army at the sprightly age of 16. In 1985, I joined a thing called the Junior Leaders Regiment Royal Artillery, which, to be quite honest, in Thatcher's 1980s, life was very different, and opportunities clearly were different. So the army was pretty much where I was always going to go, having been a pad brat. So my dad was in the army, and I grew up in Germany in the Cold War anyway. So it's pretty much all I knew. And so off I went. To be quite honest, they grabbed you on day one as a scruffy little 16-year-old and pushed you out a year later, pretty much brainwashed that you were there to be a future regimental sergeant major. And then so straight after junior leaders, or a few days before we left, you got lined up on the square, and pretty much in those days it was all about whatever sort of county you were from as to which regiment you went to. And because I was a pad brat, and my last couple of years of secondary school were back in England, so in Lincolnshire, so I ended up joining a regiment called 50 Missile Regiment Royal Artillery, who at that time were the Lincolnshire and Humberside Gunners. I knew nothing about the regiment. Well, I thought I knew nothing about the regiment. The irony was that when I got posted out there, it actually happened to be the regiment that my dad started out in. So there we go. That was a bizarre sort of twist of fate, I suppose. As opposed to a place called Menden in Germany. And again, this is the height of the Cold War, I suppose, in the mid 80s. British Army, the Rhine, which when I got out there, in sort of 1986, I think the British Army, the Rhine alone was 155,000 strong, and it was just literally a different beast. Arguably life was very simple. There was this thing called the Iron Curtain, and all the bad guys were one side, so the Soviet Union, and all the good guys were the other, under the guise of NATO, of which British Army, the Rhine was part of it. So anyway, I got posted into to my first battery, which was 19 Gibraltar Battery Royal Artillery, and I got posted into a thing called the Special Defence Group, which I can only explain as a per missile battery. So as a regiment, they had a thing called Lance, which was a battlefield tactical nuclear missile. To be talking about battlefield nuclear missiles today seems quite bizarre, but of course back in the 80s. We had literally nuclear missiles everywhere, everything from the big intercontinental ballistic types down to, like I say, Lance, which was an American missile system, of which the UK had them. And I think off the top of my head, these things had a tactical range of about 75 to 100 kilometers, which, even the notion of firing a nuclear missile in those short ranges nowadays is pretty much bizarre.
I was in a 109 regiment when I first got to Germany, and in each 109 regiment you had one gun. The NSI gun, it was the nuclear gun, and so you think 70 k's was short when they were talking about a 155 tactical nuclear weapon. Yeah. You'd be able to see it going off, and so it was a bit of a pistol gun. It'd drive forward as far as it can, fire it, and then they would try and withdraw. But obviously, it was always going to be 10, 15 k's.
But it's the only way they could overcome the sheer weight of numbers of the Soviet forces.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like I say, I joined this troop called the Special Defence Group. So within each of the missile batteries, and I think from memory there were sort of four missile batteries in the regiment. Each of those batteries had a troop, and those troops were sort of structured along the same lines as an infantry platoon, to be quite honest. And our role was pretty much, I suppose the clue is in the title, the defence of those missiles and the launchers, of which in the way that they worked, the battery was split into various troops. You had a troop that responsibility was for a thing called the MMA, so the main missile assembly, so the rocket effectively, and then another troop that was responsible for the warhead. And again, the whole sort of Cold War, the troops would never really get together until it was come to a prearranged location, normally in either a forest block in the middle of Germany somewhere, or a village or a farm that had been taken over and defended. And then again, the two parts of the missile would be mated together, and then that complete missile would then go off to its firing platform. And again, like I say, the Special Defense Group, we did everything from escorting the missiles in their various states, defending the locations where they were built and hidden. And, we would sort of convoy escort and all this sort of stuff. But again, to do that, most of our stuff was, very infantry tactics based. So much so that my personal weapon for the first 3 years was the GPMG, of which when I then sort of promoted to Lance Bombardier, the dizzy heights of, I commanded the sustained fire role GPMG SF for the troop. So yeah, quite a bizarre organisation when you look back at it now.
Yeah, they had to do pretty much the infantry courses at the infantry school in Brecon, didn't they, Lee? I think, from it rightly.
Yeah. So, I mean, we used to do all your normal sort of gunner courses, and then a whole lot of infantry stuff on top. And as a junior NCO, a Lance Bombardier, I got sent away down to the School of Infantry to do Section Commander's Battle Course, or Junior Brecon as it's referred to, which is quite interesting because, of course, when a random gunner cap badge bloke turned up at the School of Infantry and all these colour sergeants. In fact, I think my platoon instructors at the time, one was a Royal Marine, a Falklands veteran, one was Scots Guards, a Falklands veteran, and the other guy, bizarrely, was an exchange officer who was a US Ranger, and he'd been in Grenada and Panama. So of course, for then a gunner to turn up at the School of Infantry, it was all a bit weird. But yeah, I went through the same course, the same process, passed that, etc. And then on completion of that, went back to the battery to crack on, sort of thing, as it were. But sort of rewind the clock slightly. My first exposure to Special OP troop, as it was back then, and obviously, through its various stages, now 473 Special OP battery. So I was a gunner in 19 battery in the Cold War in Germany. Anyone that sort of served out in Germany at those times, remember, all you pretty much did was go on exercise. So yeah, I was on a course, again, some random woodblock in Germany, and I remember we didn't really know what was going on, but we got sort of pulled into this woodblock off of whatever we were doing, and there was a demo set up, and it turned out to be a couple of guys, a patrol actually from then OP troop. And they split us down, and the day was broken down into two parts. The first part was a sort of survival period where they were teaching us some of the basics of shelter, fire, water, food, and all that good stuff. And then in the afternoon, it was a sort of equipment demo. I think in some of your earlier podcasts, you've mentioned just the fact that, this unique organisation that no one really knew about had this aura over them. But even just to see some of the, arguably, when you look back now, basic equipment that they had, but the way that they were allowed to adapt it and use it very differently, it certainly twigged my attention. And coming from although having a gunner cap badge, coming from an infantry role, it certainly twigged my interest. So that was my first exposure of then OP troop. So we went back on the course, finished final exercise, whatever, and lo and behold, they gave me top student, and I was promoted to Lance Bombardier. So we get back to work after a weekend off or whatever it was. And within the first few days of being back, I tried to find out a bit of information about this thing called Special OP Troop with no real success. And then, I went to see the BC, the battery commander, and said that I wanted a posting to this organisation, at which point he said, no chance. I've just promoted you. I'm going to get some work out of you now. And then this went on for a couple of years, to be honest. I think the next thing that happened, and I can't remember how I actually got in touch with the then troop at the time, but next thing, I got this pretty basic, probably even just like a signed of A4, to be quite honest, that effectively said I'd been accepted to go on a pre-selection, which was effectively a kit list, a time, and a grid reference in the middle of some forest in Germany. And I think it was they stipulated on the paperwork that don't be early, don't be late, etc., etc. And so you turned up with this your Bergen effectively and your belt kit pack to survive a week in a woodblock in Germany with a rifle. And I just remember getting lined up on this track in the middle of wherever we were in Germany, and pre-selection started, which was, to be polite, probably a taster of things to come. And it was a bit of a round robin, everything from testing your physical endurance to a bit of mental endurance, I think, just by sort of sleep, food, and whatever deprivation. And I think it culminated for the last 3 days of just being sort of thrown together and put in what we were then told was an OP. Clearly, when you went on the course proper, you learn how to do that eventually. It was just, we were ragged, to be quite honest, for a week.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, we all got lined up on this track. And they just sort of went along the line and went, yes, no, no, yes, 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 no. And basically, if you got a yes, that means you could go on the course proper.
Yeah.
Thankfully, at that point, I was a yes, so I'd survived the pre-selection. Went through the time and tested selection course. Yeah, and I joined the battery, which by that stage, like I said, had just come back from the Gulf. There was the whole uncertainty over the end of the Cold War. The sort of stay behind OPs, so the Mexis was all up in the air. We pretty much knew that we weren't going to fight how we'd been fighting for the last 40 odd years of the Cold War. And then that whole journey started, I suppose, of which I was privileged to be there, as were you two, about where were we gonna take this organisation, this capability, and arguably that constant fight for getting rid of the that sort of pseudo opinion of the place, I suppose. What were we for? What were we going to do? Who were we going to support? How were we going to do it? And again,
yeah, and I think that's where we come into the Bosnian piece, because I really think that between sort of 91 after the Gulf and when you joined, Lee, to 95, it was very much a limbo period for us, trying to find a role, trying to justify our existence. Obviously, there was a Northern Ireland tour that we went on, a conventional Northern Ireland tour between in that period. But I think the Bosnian War was the start of the troop getting out to the Balkans and demonstrating its worth in different roles.
Yeah.
So we'll move on to the main subject of the pod now, and we'll start with a bit of background to the conflict in Bosnia. I've tried to simplify this as much as possible because those who know the Balkans know that it is a very, very difficult history to get across. It even makes Northern Ireland look quite simple. So the Bosnian War took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s and started on the 6th of April 1992, following a number of violent incidents earlier in the year. The war ended on the 14th of December 1995, and the main belligerents were the forces of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina and those of Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska. And these are proto-states led and supplied by Croatia and Serbia, respectively. The war was part of the breakup of Yugoslavia, one of the dividends from the Cold War ending. And following the Slovenian and Croatian successions from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1991, the multi-ethnic Social Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was inhabited by mainly Muslim Bosniaks as well as Orthodox Serbs and Catholic Croats, passed a referendum for independence on the 29th of February 1992. I told you it was complicated. You might want to be Wikipedia on this as we're going through it. Political representatives of the Bosnian Serbs boycotted the referendum and rejected its outcome. Following Bosnia and Herzegovina's declaration of independence, which gained international recognition, the Bosnian Serbs, led by Radovan Karadzic and supported by the Serbian government of Slobodan Milosevic and the Yugoslav People's Army, mobilized their forces inside Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to secure ethnic Serb territory. The war soon spread across the country, accompanied by ethnic cleansing. And I'm sure we can all remember the mass graves and the sort of concentration camps with people starving inside them, very reminiscent of World War II. So as Kev said earlier then, 473 Battery had personnel deployed in Bosnia from 95 to 2000 initially, and this was from starting off as single persons to act as unit observers, but from 96 this was increased to 6-man patrols as part of IFOR, which international, I can't even remember what that stood for. Do you remember what IFOR stood for?
Yeah, it was Implementation Force, because again it was designed, it went from the United Nations piece
to NATO,
with that extra NATO.
Yeah, it went from peacekeeping to peace enforcement. That's right, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So during this time, patrols were deployed as FO, forward observation parties, and supported British, Canadian and Malaysian commanders, and other tasks included covert and overt OPs. So Lee, you deployed to Bosnia. Can you just give an overview of sort of what you did at the time?
Yeah, so, well, before I do, it's interesting. I mean, you just mentioned there that I think the first person from the battery to deploy out to Bosnia in the very early days was the battery commander, actually. Because I remember a guy called Gary Donaldson got pulled away from the battery, which is unheard of, as a command element to get pulled away as a one-man sort of team, effectively. And he went out on UN as a whole, like you say, UN monitor, and I know he ended up in some quite sticky situations, especially around Srebrenica. But there we go. So I think I deployed just as we were moving from the I4 piece, so the implementation force, to the S4, which was the stabilization force. Again, just under the same banner as NATO. So I deployed in early '97, I think it was. Again, headed up. I was patrol commander, heading up a six-man team. And originally, we went out there again because we were joint fires or forward observer qualified. We went out there. I think our actual title at the time was we were the Commander Royal Artillery's Foo Party. But of course, like all of our journeys and stories, we were always more than just a Foo Party. We lived in a place called, or lived and worked in a place called Sipovo. Sipovo, well, where we lived is where the sort of resident light gun battery used to live and operate from. And it was during the wars, it was used as a mine factory, and we ended up living in the cellar. So, we had a bit of isolation for when we were doing planning and all that sort of stuff. But that's where we were. Like I say, we went out there as the Commander Royal Artillery's Foo Party. What that sort of gave us, arguably, was a bit of a gold card to be, a young sergeant with heading up a six-man team, to have the ear of the Commander Royal Artillery in Bosnia to just effectively go around the whole area of operations. And clearly, we were given, some sort of directed activities to achieve. What we'd end up doing was each part of the AO was breaking down into battle group areas. Within those battle group areas were your traditional Foo parties, so artillery observers. We would go and link up with them. They'd take us around their AOs. We would sort of look at the sort of laydown of targets or potential targets, choke points if needed, and of course understand the ground from there. Yeah, we ended up, in the British, in the Canadian, in the Czech areas, all over Bosnia. It was great. There we go. Pretty much the idea was that we blended in as much as possible. For all the right reasons. We wore exactly the same as all the other troops in theatre. We had two unmarked Land Rovers. I think the only difference was that, as we found out one time, we got pulled over by the RMPs who used to do these sort of random spot checks just to verify who you were, where you were going. The only difference was that where your traditional Foo party would have sort of a straightforward comms fit radio and some real basic optics, we had a whole suite of radios, including satellite, TACSAT, and this vast array of optics. So that was the only time you really knew that we were different. And of course, we never advertised the fact. We conducted a lot of discrete activities. A lot of it you'd just see this overt presence, but of course, we would be doing some discrete surveillance on probably a different sort of target set altogether. So, but yeah, it was great, to be honest. Like I said, as a young sergeant, just cutting around, we got tasked on more than one occasion by senior officers in theatre to go and do some bespoke 473 battery type taskings. One in particular, I always remember there was this village, name escapes me now, but the sort of the NATO presence in that area was all about getting these displaced people back into the village. And I think it was a Muslim village that had been fought over several times throughout the years of the war between the Serbs and the Croats. And every time one faction would move out, they'd seed the whole place with mines and booby traps. And then, of course, the inevitable would happen when the the original villagers would move back in. There'd been mine strikes and all sorts of things. So we got quite heavily involved on one particular operation, assisting with that, and literally trying to not so much, keep the factions apart, and try and rebuild this place. We also ended up doing quite a few surveillance tasks, which we would build up the pattern of life. We'd remain eyes on of a target for anywhere, from days to weeks, invariably weeks, which would then lead to raids by sort of NATO Special Operations Forces. And this is all in against a thing called PIFWICs, which was persons indicted for war crimes. So regardless of which factions they were, Serb, Croat, Muslim, etc., we would build up the whole target pack, remain eyes on, and then again allow a strike operation to go in, of which subsequently they'd be taken through the sort of international sort of criminal courts process. And I know there's been some quite high profile ones in recent years. And another one in Bosnia that we had quite an exciting task, I suppose. So there was a report of a mortar that kept being moved around a particular AO, and again it was firing onto various villages as they were trying to repopulate or rehouse all these displaced people. And various technical assets at the time, so mortar locating radars and acoustic sensors, for example, would pick these things up. But of course, they would only ever pick up the thing going bang from its point of origin, and then bang again at the point of impact.
And were they just fire on civilians or reoccupying these villages to scare them off, Lee? Is that what
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like I say, everything from mining, reseeding every time that they wore booby traps to a particular faction firing mortars into the village as the civilians were moving in. So we got tasked to basically go and find this mortar position. So, and again, I sort of really hark back to the fact that I was a young sergeant, with a well-trained team, and we were just given the free rein to go and find this thing. Clearly, we'd done some sort of initial sort of planning of the battle space from aerial photography, maps, intelligence reports, all this sort of stuff. When we narrowed it down, and for all intents and purposes, went on a great big target recce to find something. And then once we found it, again similar to the PIFWIC stuff, we'd put in an OP, get eyes on it, report it, and then coordinate from there. A strike op for NATO forces to come in and remove the threat, which they did. And got rid of that particular, like say, the mortars at the time.
I think it's worth saying that what a lot of people don't realise is in '96, when obviously there was agreement because NATO had then stepped in and did a number of NATO tasks against ground targets using air and then moving troops in, that there was a continuous friction between the factions. There was continual, and still is today. But there were some very, very sporty moments out there for, I think, all the patrols that went out there and all the NATO troops. It didn't stop. It got a little bit more. They were a little bit more sensitive to how they were doing it and a bit more discreet. But they continued on with some of their actions against their perceived enemies.
Again, some of the listeners might not realise, but this is the mid '90s in the middle of Europe, and I think. Everything, I mean, just the mass migration of various, refugees and displaced people at the time had never been seen since the Second World War. And also Bosnia and Croatia, parts of it, they had some of the largest man-laid minefields that had ever been seen. There's one down in the south of Bosnia, a place called Livno Fields, which I think we all ended up sort of tiptoeing through or near at one point. But these things just went on for miles and miles. So it's a bizarre sort of period in Europe's recent history. So
a lot of score settling went on after it as well. You go into villages and people had been shot and killed overnight. As retribution.
I mean, it was horrendous.
It was
a horrendous war in Europe, and the people now probably don't remember or have forgotten how extreme it was at stages. It was on par with the Second World War in a smaller area. Colin, obviously you did a tour out there as well in 98.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
In the area where, well, I was in the area where Lee's just mentioned, Livno, and I went there in 98. And again, very similar role. I was in charge of a 6-man patrol in the forward observation or FU role. And we were attached to the Malaysian battle group there, just us on our own. And there was an American LO there, which was quite handy because he used to give us a bit of top cover and talk about the cultural differences in armies. Every morning we had to go for the battle group commander's stand-up, and I would go there representing the FO party, and the American LO would be there. And on occasion, it wasn't unknown for the CO to slap round his ops officer in front of you when they had something gone during the night. He'd actually physically assault them in front of you. So it was not something you were used to seeing in the British or American armies, and me and that American officer used to talk about it quite a bit. So this folded after a bit, and we were withdrawn. But I was quite lucky in that we were, for admin purposes, under 19 Regiment. And the BC of one of the batteries there knew what 473 battery could do, and he gave us a number of covert OPs to do. And it was mainly watching for arms shipments. We did a couple on a factory where they were suspected of shipping arms out. And basically we ran ourselves, so we had a 4-man team in a base, and 2 of them would be there to help guide the QRF if there was any trouble. And then normally we just deployed in 2-man OPs. And I'll go back to what Lee was saying, about giving a lot of responsibility as a young sergeant. I mean, I wasn't particularly young at the time, I was 30, but I think this is where the battery maybe took what was happening for granted a little bit and didn't capitalise on it because this was expected of you. So we were running these covert OPs, and General Delves up in Banja Luka, who was the commander of British forces, I got to hear about this. And General Delves was ex-Hereford, SAS. He'd fought in the Falklands. And I was told I had to fly up to Banja Luka to brief him. So off I jumped in a helicopter, flew up to Banja Luka, briefed General Delves, who basically turned around and said to me, "What optics, what cameras you got?" And I said, we don't have a lot, we've got some basic kit. And he turned around to the major with him and said, "Get him what he needs, go out, local purchase, camera kit, all the rest of it." And he said, "And by the way, you're going to go and you're going to be attached to the Green Jacket Recce platoon, and you're going to start doing OPs with them." So we went down to the Green Jacket Recce platoon, and I think it was Gorny Vakuf they were, so we moved to Gorny Vakuf. And that was difficult, because you can imagine, going back to what you were saying, Lee, about turning up at the School of Infantry, gunner cap badge. I turned up at the Green Jacket Recce platoon. They'd just done 2 years COP in Belfast, and we get told you're having these gunners come in and being part of you. To be fair, the lads were very good. The senior NCO, the Recce platoon sergeant, was less accommodating, and he barely spoke to me for the whole time we were there. He really resented us being there for some reason. So I was given the first task of planning and controlling an op where it'd be a joint Royal Green Jackets and 473 battery op. There'd be 5 OPs going in to overwatch all major routes in and out of the town of Dravar for a week. And again, this is to do with movement of suspected criminals, war criminals, and also arms shipments. So the Green Jackets supplied 4 teams and I was the 5th, and I was what they called, from a COP platoon perspective, the controller. I was given the op. I was in charge of the op. I think this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, if it went pear-shaped, the Green Jackets could blame me and pass the blame on to the gunners and walk away with the reputation intact. And also, I think it was to see what skills we had. It was interesting to see the range of skills. We thought that, having been in a COP platoon, their skills would be, really, really top-notch. Yeah. And they were. But there were some aspects that surprised us. So when I was given the orders for the deployment, I got a few worried looks when I said we were going in for 5 or 6 days without resupply. Now, seemingly in the COP, they had been things like they'd have hot flasks of hot brews taken in of a night time.
Yeah.
And things like that. So, again, totally different way of operating. Yeah. We weren't just used to it. So when I said, no, we're going in proper hard routine.
Yeah, cold routine, isn't it?
Yeah, cold routine, no resupply. It raised a few eyebrows. We were quite lucky, though, and the job was a success. We did subsequent ones from that, and basically the fallout from that was when General Delves formed the Dismounted Reconnaissance Unit, which endured as a capability until UK troops left theatre. But going back to what Lee said, I was on the phone back to the UK saying, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing. And I just don't think they got it, because you were just expected to do that. And I really do think it was probably a missed opportunity for the battery at the time to get right in there.
I was going to say the same thing, because my tour was 96 and we did exactly the same thing for the Dutch and for someone else. We sent the reports back saying what we were doing. Again, they missed that opportunity. They didn't see the importance of the Balkans for our future, perhaps. And actually, we could have took over as a COP sort of role for the Falklands, like Northern Ireland. And that's where you influence at the early stages, you shape it, and actually you become this asset that nobody will deploy without. And I do think that perhaps our hierarchy did miss that window of opportunity, because it wasn't just a one-off. Your tour was in 97, your tour in 98, the tour in 99 carried that on. There was 4 years of a lot of covert operations and a lot of covert work at a high level in probably a more challenging environment than Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. I mean, for example, going back to what Lee was saying about the minefields, I mean, part of the recce's that we were doing for the job round Devara is we had to go on our bellies with prodders, mine prodders, and actually prod clear lanes into the OP positions.
Yeah.
And again, the comms is very difficult. You know what Bosnia's like, very mountainous. Line of sight comms are extremely difficult. So a lot of it was TACSAT, but TACSAT back then was that massive radio set with the unfolding umbrella. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
Not the handheld jobs, they were massive.
And also the opposition, they would think nothing about bringing an armoured vehicle up and using it against a building or an OP. They had no qualms. There was no, we won't do anything. They had no qualms at all about using their weapon systems, their vehicles and all the rest of it to find you. You were up against, a well-trained army with some good equipment. Moving on slightly then, there was a peace agreement. The tensions continued in Bosnia. And then in 1998, the Kosovo campaign started to emerge to the conflict that people remember in 1999. So moving on to that phase, again, Lee, you deployed to Kosovo in 99. So as you did with Bosnia, an overview of that tour, please.
Yeah, so again, the whole Kosovo thing, for those that are not really aware, it was part of the continuation of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which, Bosnia was, well, arguably the start point after the death of Tito several years before. So Kosovo, arguably fought over with the predominantly Albanians, Kosovars, and the Serbs. But I remember it was very early in 99, probably around about late January, early February. I think the balloon went up, and as an organisation, 473 Battery always ready. And I remember we just got very little detail, and I think in a heartbeat, a troop flew out to Macedonia at the time, and it was carnage when we got there. I remember there was snow on the ground. We landed. We then got bussed by some bizarre civilian buses into this old, well, we thought it was an abandoned Macedonian artillery camp. Yeah. But I think it was actually occupied, and it was just...
They just emptied it.
Yeah, just emptied it and, walked away, and we moved in, sort of thing. And I remember we'd all got there. There was, hundreds of us there, sort of thing, from various organisations.
Lee, sorry, can I just jump in? Sorry, I didn't quite understand, or I missed it, because I wasn't in the battery this time. What size is this deployment? Was it a couple of patrols with an HQ element, or?
So this was a troop, so a troop of 4 patrols, and I'll talk about the 4th patrol in a minute. But yes, it was just a troop, so 4 patrols, headed up by a young captain, and he had a sergeant just sort of shadowing him and a couple of signallers. So I think probably 30 of us all up, if that. We went out there. We ended up in this abandoned Macedonian camp. There was snow on the ground, and it was it was carnage because no one really knew what was going on. We just sort of got out there that quickly, and I think even as simple as things like food was an issue because the chefs, the military chefs, were just having to go downtown and buy whatever they could. And I think for 3 meals a day for quite a few weeks, it was pretty much bread, pasta, and potatoes was pretty much, the staple diet. But yeah, so there was a whole load of, unknowns. And as always with these things, the political appetite to commit troops, there's a certain point where, you've reached a sort of a go, no go type line and you've crossed it. So as always, we were always constantly listening into the World Service over the HF radios that we had, because it's pretty much the only way we could communicate back to the UK, and also via a thing called Porter's Head Radio, which was the old and bold over HF. You could dial in back to the UK on a certain frequency. Porter's Head near Bristol would reorientate its antennas. You could effectively link up on a phone back in the UK. But anyway, that aside. So we always knew there was a lot of political tensions going on in the background. And I think even quite early on in the sort of February when we were there was this, I think what we termed Operation Certain Death, which was pretty much the patrols were just going to lift up, fly forward, sit and hold or observe into death while sort of NATO drove up the road, which, funny old thing, is pretty much what happened later on in the summer anyway. So like I say, for the first few days and weeks, it was all about sort of sorting kit out and just, having some sort of shakeout training. I remember there was helicopters available at the drop of a hat. We did a lot of stuff of, drop-offs, pickups at night, just sort of shaking out RTTPs. And there we were. And then we got some retasking orders. Kev was there as well. And we were told to push to the border of Kosovo, of Macedonia, Kosovo border. And of which I think, again, to understand the context, there was a whole raft of different military forces out there under different missions. So we went out under a NATO mission. There was already a standing United Nations mission out there. The French were out there doing their own thing, because I remember we literally bumped into the French Foreign Legion on the border one time.
Like the French doing the wrong thing, is it?
No, exactly. Yeah, they were pretty grumpy when we appeared. Well, we actually compromised them. I think they were French Foreign Legion, and then there was this organisation called the OSCE, so the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in
Europe. Yeah.
And they were just sort of driving around Kosovo doing things. So it was really complex at the time. So like I say, we got orders to push up to the border. We proper made the French moody because we compromised them. Got over that. There was certain parts where we could go, we couldn't go. So of course, the places we couldn't go, we went in at night and all this sort of stuff to get some eyes on. And we ended up in effectively an overt stance, but as always, conducting some discreet or covert activity, which was pretty much overwatching or looking into Kosovo, into the Prezovo Valley, I think it was, which was all the fielded forces, Serbian forces were there, all their artillery positions, anti-air air defense systems, etc. And effectively, our task was to observe. Simultaneously, the NATO air campaign started, and we used to watch all the air and even cruise missiles, I think, at the time going in. And then we would watch the reaction of the Serbs and then report back. And, even just their AAA would fire up at all the aircraft going over, which, of course, as soon as they started firing and we could see the tracer, what a great target indicator for us to observe and report back and just build up that whole picture and go from there. So, and I think at one point, bizarrely, myself and Kev's patrol were the furthest forward British troops for the whole of the contingent out there. And bear in mind, the initial contingent out there was then 4 Armoured Brigade. So it was all about this big, heavy armoured brigade with lots of, experience of riding around the German planes that arrived in through Macedonia and up into Kosovo sort of thing. And they were in assembly areas. And
Lee, can I just jump in? Sorry, yep. I think it's an interesting thing for me to point out. I think one of the dividends from the Cold War that the battery's been lucky to hold on to is the fact that we have sergeant patrol commanders, and this isn't commented on enough, I think. I mean, the reason sergeants led, normally in the army, like a conventional FST, fire support team, or back in the day, a forward observation officer team, was led by a captain. And the reason our patrol started off was they let them be sergeants because the main reason an officer is there is to brief other officers. And because of the stay behind role, you wouldn't need to brief officers, so they were happy for sergeants to be patrol commanders. And it's always surprised me, actually, that we've managed to retain that sergeant patrol commander as opposed to having an officer in there, because what you're talking about now, I've no doubt that you're starting to brief, as I had done during my stint in Bosnia, you're starting to brief senior officers in Its headquarters and that sort of thing. So I think it's an interesting point to point out.
Yeah. And again, like I say, we were building up this whole picture, and I think on more than one occasion, either both of us, Kev, or separately, we got lifted off the ground to go back and brief and all this sort of stuff. And then, again, where we're now, we're probably in a sort of mid to late spring of 99 by now, and then 5 Airborne Brigade turned up in theatre. And again, the political situation was still ongoing. We were just cracking on, doing our thing, looking over the border, doing stuff. And I remember we got called in, or pulled back effectively to, it was somewhere near Skopje, which was the sort of Macedonian airport, but we ended up in a vineyard. That's what springs to mind. It was quite close to the border. And Kev and I got sort of pulled in, and as you can imagine, we've been living out in the boony for a while, so we were a bit dishevelled or whatever. But we ended up outside this makeshift fire brigade headquarters, and then we sort of got called over to a Land Rover bonnet. Someone put a map down, and a load of PF, so Pathfinder platoon, turned up as well. And I think at the time there's got random Hereford guys there as well. And yeah, basically someone said, right, the Russians are coming, and their ambition is to go and take Pristina Airport. And again, I think, Kev, you probably did the same laugh at the time. But they went, yeah, basically, your 2 patrols, mine and Kev's, plus Pathfinder platoon and these kind of random Hereford guys, you're going to fly forward, capture Pristina Airport and stop the Russians coming. And again, I think we had that same laugh. But, it was one of these proper... Again, going back to your point earlier, Con, that we were just sergeants. We had a captain troop commander there who was running in and out of 5 Airborne Brigades headquarters at the time, getting updates. But there was very little information. So basically, and the next thing, we sort of turned around, and all these para-reg guys were turning up, just dumping ammo with us, because basically we were told to empty our Bergens, fill them with ammo, which I think it turned out that every other man had a GPMG and a Bergen full of, linked ammo. And those that didn't have a GPMG were carrying a rifle.
94
and the 94 anti-tanks, yeah. And we just sort of looked at each other. There's no imagery, no real mission, no real orders. And it was just like, yeah, just fly forward and stop the Russians. And we were like, wow.
It's going to be rocks drift all over again.
Yeah. Like you say, it was... At that stage of my career, certainly, it was like, wow, I finally made it. This is my whatever, my raw drift almost. So I remember we then sort of picked up all this ammo and these Bergens and, like I say, GPMGs and 94s, and we had to go into this vineyard where the HLSs had been cleared. And of course, the world's press was there, including K80 from Sky News at the time, and you can guarantee wherever there was trouble, she was there. So we knew something was going to go down. And then we sort of got on these helicopters. We were on a Puma, and it was a baking red hot sort of early summer now. We just sort of sat there, first of all, the helicopters were turning and burning, then they'd turn them off, and we'd just sit there, and then they'd start up again, and we didn't really know what was going on. And this went on pretty much all day, and I think at one point we just all got out and laid underneath the helicopter. They turned it off just to get some shade or whatever. But then, it turned out that, and we didn't realise until very late on in that day, I think it was probably near enough dark when someone said stand down, but it turned out that General Mike Jackson, who was the head of the sort of NATO forces on the ground at the time, had accordingly had this chat with Tony Blair back in the UK that there was no way he was prepared to start World War III over some Russians, driving, because they were driving down from Bosnia, because clearly they had an influence in that area. He said there was no way he was going to start World War III over an airport, and the Russians could have it. So again, like I say, it was all bizarre, and we got stood down very late at night. I think in true style, we just sort of laid there, getting our head down. I think we'd by this stage sort of repacked our Bergens again, and then got told, with a quick heads up set of orders. And the next thing we knew that, tomorrow was D-Day. Which was when we were going to then fly forward again with Pathfinder platoon.
What did the Pathfinder guys think of these random non-airborne guys attached to them, Lee? Were they pretty well cool with you? Or
yeah. I think because
I don't think they cared at the time. Everyone was looking at the initial mission, which is go to face the Russians, I don't think they really cared who went with them, just as long as more people.
No, exactly, just more ammo, yeah. And I think through various exercises and courses and experiences beforehand, we'd all done the similar sort of advanced force type training anyway. So it's just that they purely supported then 5 Airborne Brigade and today 16 Air Assault Brigade, and the battery then and today supported, divisional and everyone else really. So, but no, there was no animosity. So the next thing we got this orders that tomorrow was D-Day, and then like I say, we got recocked. We got put onto Kevin Mine's patrol. Bear in mind, another patrol. I mentioned earlier there was 4 patrols to start with. So as the air campaign started, it was one of the guys, Animal, his team had to recock and go back into Bosnia because we all the way up to this point we'd had this standing commitment in Bosnia. Bosnia hadn't gone away, so a troop of 4 patrols. The air campaign started. They pulled 1 patrol off as to push that back into Bosnia. So that left us 3, mine, Kev's, and another one. And then again, here we are. One of the patrols had been pushed up into the mountains to look into the deep. So we're sat on this Puma again, which was called Chalk 4, and that was as simple as it was. All the PF had got onto these Chinooks. Again, press was there. And then there was a whole sort of delay because we had to wait for some attack helicopters to turn up, because at the time the Brits never had Apache, but I think it was American Apaches that turned up to escort us in. So we all took off. It was very early in the morning. I always remember we took off, flew over this massive refugee camp. And so you sort of we were heading north, into Kosovo over the mountains. On the left, you had this massive refugee camp, and then literally lined up on this single track road, from the south going north was pretty much the whole of NATO, with 4 armoured brigade, the Brit armour, just lined up one after each other, pointing towards the border. So we took off. I remember we had the headsets on. It was one of those classics where the door gunner was hanging out one side. All of our burgers were dumped in the middle. There was no sort of seat belts or safety or all that. And I think he said something like, if it all kicks off, I'll shoot out this door. You lot shoot out that door. And I think that was pretty much the pre-flight brief. Yeah. And it was as simple as that, I think, from what I remember.
Yeah, it was.
And then I remember we took off, and I think we had the in-flight headsets on as well. And next thing, we just started hovering on top of these mountains. And I think it was, I can't remember which one it was, one of us, Kev, but we had to remind the pilot that, downwash from helicopters can set off mines, because we had the experience from Bosnia and places like that. So he sort of hovered for a bit longer. And I think one of them shouted through, one of the aircrew, that the whole thing had been scrapped. And we were like, really? And then, of course, the helicopters turned back towards where we'd started from, back into Macedonia. We flew back over the same NATO convoys, the same refugee camp, which by this time all the refugees were starting to sort of come out of their, sort of big white UN tents. And, we thought, here we go, another damp squib, it's been turned off again. And the next thing, one of the aircrew just shouted something like 3 minutes, you'll be on the ground. And so we just sort of spun back round again, flew straight in, low and fast. All the helicopters got to a prearranged point. They had overwatch from the Apaches. We all split, and our Puma with sort of Kev's team and my team. I think there was some random firing on the way in as well. I can't remember, but yeah. And literally next thing, we're throwing Bergens and people out the door. The Puma took off. The Apache stayed in the overwatch, and then it was definitely silent. We were in Kosovo, and the idea was that Kev and my team, we sort of stayed together as an 8-man team for a while, because we stopped just short of an abandoned village.
Yeah.
But again, from memory, a load of women and children came out, and because people had been sleeping outside the buildings, and through a bit of, I think I could speak a bit of, squaddy German from the good old days of, Dortmund and whatever. And
what? So you're asking for a beer?
For a beer and a Bradford, yeah, exactly. Which they were quite confused about. But that, and I think, and again, one of the lads had taught himself some, really basic Albanian as well. So, but anyway, we'd established that obviously the menfolk had either been taken away months beforehand by the Serbs, or had gone away and joined the UCK. So what was referred to as the Kosovo Liberation Army. So it was just women and children, and they were afraid to sleep inside the buildings in case the Serbs came and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, we sort of found out, spoke to them. They gave us a bit of hint, as to the places to avoid, the routes not to take because of mines and all this sort of stuff. And then I remember we just ended off tabbing off into this big forestry block as a team of 8 at this point, the 2 patrols. And I don't know, about an hour in, I think the lead scout went down on one knee and everyone thought, right, it's going to kick off big style. And we came across a sentry point. I think again, UCK, the Kosovo militia, Kosovo Liberation Army. And there was a bit of a Mexican standoff. Thankfully, they never shot at us, which was nice for a change. And again, we established from then who they were. I think they guided us through for another bit. And then we got to a certain point where a prearranged RV where both patrols split off. And then again, we had to go and establish OPs and look for Serb troop movements and formations, because the idea was by now, as part of the peace accord, was that the Serbs should be leaving. Clearly, it wasn't as straightforward as that. And then, so there we were in our OPs, reporting, eyes on, all that good stuff. And clearly, Pathfinders, they were in a similar area to us, doing the same sort of thing, eyes on. And then the idea was that once I think we flew in about 25 Ks ahead or something of the Kajanic defile. And then, we didn't realise at the time, other than over the radio, but clearly it was all over the world's press that, the whole of NATO literally drove up the road, which was a combination of I think it was one para and the Gurkhas, literally either tabbing straight up, the Gurkhas tabbed up to clear all the tunnels. One para sort of pepper potted in helicopter lifts, and then the armour followed all the way up the road. So that was us in Kosovo. A couple of days later, 3 or 4 days later, I think we then both got retasked. I got pulled. We went off bizarrely north of Pristina Airport, or in the area of Pristina Airport, to get Overwatch. Again, we come across this village, which is all sort of smouldering, and the Serbs had just basically fired tank rounds into all the houses as they left, and there was some mass graves that were still freshly dug, and again, women and children just appeared from nowhere, sort of thing. And again, we were in a very overt stance on this task. We'd passed some Serb formations moving and convoys. They were all very jubilant. They had a particular sort of 3-fingered salute, which was effectively, it meant Brother Serb. And they were very jubilant because they saw themselves as the victors, not as a defeated army. So we pushed out. All these civilians came to see us because they thought we were this conquering force, all 4 of us, and then they wanted to tell it. Yeah, in a Land Rover, with a big Union flag on the top, so that the A10s didn't, mistake us or anything like that. So it was all very bizarre again. And then next thing, all these young and old men all turned up in various, uniforms and weaponry and all this sort of stuff. And again, it turned out to be the local UCK. This guy claimed to be the commander. He took me and Richie. We went off on this patrol, which was, we knew something was up straight away because the first thing they did was cock their weapons, and off they went, sort of thing. So we followed them, and we went to this place where the Serbs had just pulled out. There was no one there, but we stayed there for probably about another week, I think. Again, just pattern of life, all that good stuff in an overt stance, collecting information, which we would then feed back to become intelligence. I think we did some weapon seizures at one point, a bit of a standoff again. But there we go. And then I think, so that probably a couple of weeks in by then, and then we got pulled into Pristina. By this point, all the armour had sort of pushed in and beyond Pristina. Ironically, NATO was looking after the Russians that had gone into the airport in the end. I think they put a Gurkha battalion in there to protect the Russians in the end and give them food and water and all that sort of stuff. So it was all very, very bizarre. Like I say, and we keep referring back to that fact that, we were just sergeants that were heading these teams up in the middle of this complex, war in Europe, dealing everything with, Serb field forces on one end of the spectrum to displace civilians and whatever on the other end. So certainly never forget what we got up to. I think we then got recalled into an old bus station on the outskirts of Pristina. The sort of artillery group that we'd been affiliated to were there. We got sort of resupplied food, water, etc., and got some retaskings. I think at one point I got orders for an OP, which was supposed to be just sort of like 5 days to go and watch a UCK headquarters on the outskirts of Pristina. That then ended up into something like a 6-week task from what I remember. We ended up pushing into an urban area on the outskirts of the city looking in. Again, it was a discreet task. So overtly, people knew we were there. But of course, we'd be overtly looking one way in activity, pointing in one direction. But all the real stuff, was actually, as you alluded to earlier, camera lenses and whatnot, looking at the target and collating that information. By this point, it was one para. One para had become literally the ground holding battle group in the middle of Pristina. And they were doing, and they were the right people, arguably at the time. They turned Pristina into Belfast or Londonderry in the 70s, and they proper got a grip of the place. They had an information operations campaign where they were putting leaflets out to say that, we're the Red Devils and we are here to secure the place and keep you all safe. But of course, you had this whole micro conflict in Pristina, the capital, where you had Serb civilians and enclaves still. You had Kosovar Albanians in their sort of various parts of the city. Various factions were going around booby trapping civilian properties. Most days there was contacts going on. So it's still a very complex place to be. And then from memory, Kev, we ended up as part of an OP matrix. In the middle of Pristina.
All the high buildings had an OP overwatch. Again, very much like the Northern Ireland model, which is to dominate the ground. Yeah. As Lee was saying, the Liberation Forces, KLA, UCK, some of them were not, some of them criminals, and the rule of law had broken down completely.
Yeah. So, and then I think by this stage now, it's probably late summer. I remember one night there was a whole load of celebratory fire in the middle of Pristina. All the locals had come out with, in cars and flags hanging out, and people celebratory firing out of some roofs, which was always interesting because a lot of them forgot that when you fire in the air, that bullet doesn't stay in the air; it comes down somewhere. But again, they were just celebrating the fact that NATO were there. I think Tony Blair turned up in the middle of Pristina to give some sort of, we are NATO. I think by sort of early to mid-September, we then got pulled out and flew back to UK, and that was our sort of first trip out to Kosovo. And then, you didn't have we went on a couple of weeks leave and all that sort of stuff, and then it was Christmas, and bizarrely we had an exercise before Christmas. Of course we did. We cracked on back in the UK. I then got sent out on New Year's Day out to Brunei with the team to go and do the whole jungle warfare instructors course, which was great. So a couple of months out there, and then we got pulled back about a week early because what I didn't realise while we were in Brunei was that the head shed from the battery had then been called out to Kosovo again. So this is early 2000 now, to go and look at a complete battery deployment because the dynamics were the same, but the situation different in terms of rather than looking for fielded forces, i.e. Serbian primarily, this was now all about filling the gaps for that surveillance and target acquisition piece. And again, going back to some of the stuff we did in Bosnia was the whole looking for, criminals and persons indicted for war crimes and all that sort of thing. And then again, like I say, I think by Easter that year, so within 6 months of being back in the UK from Kosovo the first time, we got banged straight out there as a whole battery this time. And again, the whole raft of tasks that the battery got up to. And I just remember that, we were constantly deployed. We'd be out on a task for what we thought was a few days. It would invariably end up being a few weeks. We'd come back in, pretty much get a set of orders and then bounce back out again. And that was pretty much, all of 2000, I think, the year 2000. So, I think really, that's my memories of the Balkans. Certainly Kosovo for those 2 years. Like I say, I just keep going back to the point where, as a sergeant or a group of young sergeants, we were given all this responsibility. It was all about our reputation. It was about the battery, the capability, the organisation finding its feet after the Cold War and life after Mexis. Lots of people were then starting to understand who this formerly secretive organisation were. And more importantly, I think Colin said earlier about that whole cap badge bias, that, all of a sudden a load of blokes with gunner cap badges could do this thing and do it well. And our reputation, was sound. And some of the stuff that we did in the early and mid days of both Bosnia and certainly the early days of Kosovo, then set the conditions for follow-on organisations to continue the thread in the Balkans in later years. I remember ending up as a staff sergeant, ending up down in Warminster at the light roll recce division, and I was teaching people, tactics, techniques, and procedures to go out and do the stuff that we were doing, but they were going out to the Balkans as a formed unit, as a subunit. So our reputation, went from strength to strength because of our experiences.
I think it's fair to say that the Balkans were probably the saving point for the battery when they were looking for a new role, options for change. Balkans came in. We were able to show the agility of the unit and the fact that we would learn quickly and bring new skills in, help formulate these specialist reconnaissance units, specialise in those particular theatres of operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. And if you can do it there, you can do it somewhere else. And I think one of the important parts about all this is we were cheap. We were cheap at it. Yeah. We get a lot of bang for the buck as well, because we were able to turn quite quickly. We had that mindset.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, like you say, and for a few sort of locally purchased cameras and then wet film and whatever it may be, and some of the kit that we had, because I think certainly the battery, we've all experienced of various similar organizations from other international armies. The Americans is always a good one, but I think where the battery's always been a step ahead is it's not about the equipment. You can buy all the fancy equipment in the world and give it to the people. It's the soldiers, and that time spent in training. And it goes back to the patrol course itself, 13, 14 weeks is now, I think. But it's a long old course, but that's where that investment is made early, because, and I think General Stone said, on his initial sort of interview right at the very beginning, and when he created the organisation, there is no substitute for the Mark 1 eyeball.
No.
And if you put a well-trained, brain in between that set of Mark 1 eyeballs, predominantly as it was in our case, or is now still, the rank of sergeant that's making those pretty important decisions on the ground for a commander. And when I say for the commander, as in those decisions we were making, feeding it up the chain of command to 1, 2-star organisations. Pretty special.
Oh, thank you very much, Lee. That was fantastic. And we're now moving on to the usual part where we do our Desert Island Dits, in which our guest picks their favourite book, film, and luxury item. So, Lee, what are your choices?
Yes, in terms of book, again, I've recently reread it. It's called Panzer Leader, and it's about Heinz Guderian, who was a Prussian army officer, but effectively he was the creator of what we see as modern armoured warfare or combined arms operations today. A professional army officer, was never sort of part of the whole Nazi party or anything like that. And even at the end of the Second World War, when all the sort of tribunals went through, he was cleared of any sort of associations with that. And ironically, his son ended up as a senior army officer in the Bundeswehr. But it's an amazing book. He saw some experiences in the First World War, developed in that sort of fallow period when Germany between the wars were not supposed to be creating arms and munitions, but he was responsible for creating all these tactics. And I mean, he created what is blitz, what we all refer to as blitzkrieg. Those successes in France, which in no time all pushed the BAF onto the beaches, but also those early days into Poland and arguably to the gates of Moscow are all credit to that man there. So it's an amazing read, really highly recommended. The film, I mean, it's a classic. You can't beat a good old war film. But The Longest Day, I mean, that film traditionally comes out, your Christmas and Easter and all that good stuff. They certainly don't make films like that anymore. But I could literally watch that every day of the week.
Do you not think it looks a bit crap now compared to things like Saving Private Ryan, Lee? You can't be watching that every time.
No, exactly. You can. I mean, just look at the actors alone, that are in that film. The fact that most of them were serving predominantly in the war anyway. So some of the experiences they bought, even just the equipment they had was all, because it was made early 60s, I think. So it wasn't that far after the Second World War that it was made in the first place. But it's just an epic film.
I thought so.
Yeah, outstanding. And I think my sort of luxury item, it's got to be, it's a combination. It's coffee, effectively. I've been to some amazing places in the world with the army, but we have this obsession of everywhere we go, we take with us some of the nastiest tasting coffee in compo. But yeah, so to me, it's coffee with a nice camping cafetiere.
You can tell you're an officer now, mate. Where's it all gone wrong?
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. So yeah, coffee. There's the answer.
Okay, my recommendation is My War Gone By, I Miss It So by Anthony Loyd. I think, Kev, you've read this one as well.
Yeah, excellent.
So he's I think he was light infantry. He actually served in Bosnia, and he's currently defence correspondent for the Times, and he based a lot of the experiences in that book on what happened in Bosnia and Chechnya. So he discusses the war, the adrenaline rush we got from the war, and he actually became a heroin addict in London after he got back to sort of the relaxed environment of the capital. He did the traditional sort of war correspondent thing that he did in Vietnam, i.e. he just jumped on a plane and got over there and chanced his luck with no press credentials and not working for anybody. And he was not one of those photographers for sitting in a briefing room. He had to be in the thick of it, and he started off by being a war photographer. And he got a break when the French correspondent for the Telegraph was wounded by a Claymore mine set off by Croat forces and asked Loyd to fill in and send out some dispatches for him. So Loyd agreed, and he started his first job as a journalist, and he's put on a retainer by the Times. He also has done a couple of interesting things. It was him that found Shamina Begum in the refugee camp. And he did a really great article recently in the Sunday Times where he tracked down a load of Vietnam veterans that were photographed with Don McCullen, and he found out where they were. And he tried to find the US Marine in Hue, the shell shock, the iconic photograph. But unfortunately, he didn't actually get him. So what are you doing, Kev, this week then?
Mine's the Forgotten Highlander, and it's Alistair Urquhart. Hopefully I've said that right.
No, totally wrong. Urquhart.
Urquhart. God. There you go. Thank you for your help, Colin.
I'll do the translating.
Yeah. Just don't forget the mute button next time when you're trying to talk. And this was a remarkable story of survival during World War II. A Scottish soldier, a young Scottish soldier, he survived the work camps. He survived being sunk at sea. He was a prisoner of war on board a Japanese ship, and the Americans torpedoed it, and he did 5 days adrift at sea, one of the few survivors. And then eventually he was moved to a mine near Nagasaki and survived the atomic bomb and witnessed it as well. A young soldier.
Hell, talk about bad luck.
Yeah, I mean, it was a proper story, because he was captured by the Japanese in Singapore, forced into manual labour as a POW. He survived 750 days in the jungle working on the Death Railway and building a bridge on the River Kwai. He was then moved, as I say, by ship, which was then torpedoed. He survived that. He was then recaptured by the Japanese. He was taken to Japan, worked in a mine in Nagasaki, a couple of months before the dropping of the atomic bomb. And he saw that happen, and then he was freed, and then he was recovered back to the UK. But an horrendous story. I mean, we've talked about it before about the 14 Army, the Forgotten Army and such things. And their war was as horrific as they can be, sometimes not given the publicity that perhaps it should do. The book covers a little bit about his moving to civilian life, but it also talks about, as part of this discharge, when he got back to the UK and was medically looked after, then he was discharged, he had to sign a disclaimer to never talk about his treatments as a POW, because I think there was some political swaying about not talking about the treatment from the Japanese against the British. Don't know why. It's something I've never heard about before, but it just seems like they didn't want to have that angst against the Japanese, because obviously Japan post-Second World War didn't have it didn't have to capitulate in the same way that Germany did, because the Americans took over, kept the emperor in place. The war trials were probably not as highly publicised or as in depth as probably the German war trials. So, but it's a fascinating book. The man, it makes Papillon look, soft. He had a proper hard war, as a POW. Absolutely horrendous.
Okay, Lee, so thanks for coming on, mate, and having a chat with us about Bosnia and Kosovo. And also thanks to the listener for your continued support and suggestions. And as normal, if you want to get in touch, our email address is at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the social media platforms such as Instagram, Facebook and YouTube. So get on there, follow us and give us a write-up if you get the opportunity. Especially if you download from iTunes, because that's one of the best ways of getting the podcast out to the masses. We're currently working on our next guest, and we've got a great podcast lined up. We can't announce it yet because he's not quite confirmed, but it'll be an absolute belter. And finally, thanks to Nick Beale for sponsoring the series and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.